Jerusalem. For nearly a century, its walls had stood under the banners of the Crusaders. But in the summer of 1187, an army unlike any they had faced before was approaching. Its commander was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. To the west, he would become known as Saladin. He had united Egypt and Syria, gathered thousands of warriors beneath his command, and waited patiently for the moment when the Crusader kingdoms would make their move. Then, at the horns of Hattin, that moment came. Under a merciless sun, the Crusader army was surrounded, exhausted, and cut off from water. What followed was one of the most devastating defeats in the history of the Crusades. And within months, Jerusalem would fall. But who was the man behind this victory? How did Saladin rise from a relatively unknown commander to become the most feared Muslim ruler of his age? And why, centuries later, would even some of his enemies remember him with respect? This is the story of Saladin, the Sultan who defeated the Crusaders. Part 1: The Rise of Saladin. In the 12th century, the Middle East was a world divided. Powerful rulers fought for control of cities, trade routes, and fertile lands. And in the center of this struggle stood one of the most important cities in the Islamic world, Damascus. It was here, in 1137, that a boy named Yusuf ibn Ayyub was born. History would remember him by another name: Saladin. He was born into a Kurdish family of military and political importance. His father, Najm al-Din Ayyub, served powerful rulers in Syria and Mesopotamia. From an early age, Saladin was surrounded by politics, warfare, and the constant struggle for power. But he was not initially destined to become a legendary warrior. As a young man, Saladin was more interested in religion and scholarship than in the battlefield. That would change quickly. The Middle East was facing a growing threat. For almost a century, Crusader states had controlled important territories along the eastern Mediterranean. Jerusalem was at the heart of their world. And for Muslim rulers, recovering the Holy City had become a powerful political and religious goal. Saladin entered this dangerous world under the command of his uncle, Shirkuh, a skilled military commander serving the Syrian ruler Nur ad-Din. In the 1160s, Saladin traveled with Shirkuh to Egypt. The mission was supposed to be temporary. Instead, it would change his life forever. Egypt was rich, strategically important, and politically unstable. Whoever controlled Egypt could potentially control the entire eastern Mediterranean. In 1169, after Shirkuh's death, Saladin unexpectedly became the new vizier of Egypt. He was still relatively young. But now he commanded armies and controlled the wealth of one of the most important regions in the Islamic world. Saladin understood that survival depended on more than winning battles. He needed loyalty. He needed money. And above all, he needed unity. Over the following years, he strengthened his position in Egypt and gradually expanded his influence beyond it. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, the political balance of the region changed completely. Saladin moved into Syria. Damascus came under his control. Then Aleppo and other territories became part of his growing sphere of influence. Step by step, he was building something that had not existed for generations. A powerful political and military force capable of confronting the Crusader states. But Saladin knew that the Crusaders could not be defeated by courage alone. He would need patience. He would need strategy. And he would have to wait for the right moment. Because the greatest battle of his life was still years away. And its destination was Jerusalem. Part 2: Uniting the Muslim World. By the late 1170s, Saladin was no longer simply a commander in Egypt. He was becoming the most powerful ruler in the Muslim world. But power came with a problem. His enemies were not only the Crusaders. Muslim rulers were also fighting one another. Syria was divided between competing factions, powerful cities, ambitious governors, and rival dynasties. Saladin understood the danger. If the Muslim world remained divided, the Crusader states would survive. So he began a campaign of political consolidation. Some cities surrendered. Others resisted. And in some places, Saladin had to fight Muslim armies before he could turn his attention toward the Crusaders. His goal was clear. Unite Egypt and Syria under one authority. Damascus became one of the centers of his growing empire. From there, Saladin organized his armies, strengthened his fortresses, secured supply routes, and built a system capable of supporting long military campaigns. But he was not only a warrior. Saladin also understood the importance of legitimacy. He presented himself as a defender of Islam and a ruler committed to restoring Muslim control over territories lost to the Crusaders. Mosques, schools, and religious institutions received his support. His reputation spread across the region. Yet the Crusader kingdoms remained a formidable enemy. They controlled Jerusalem, Acre, Antioch, and other heavily fortified cities and castles. Their knights were experienced. Their fortresses were difficult to capture. And their armies could move quickly when threatened. Saladin therefore avoided unnecessary battles. He preferred to weaken his enemies gradually. He attacked supply routes. He pressured isolated fortresses. He disrupted trade. He gathered intelligence. And he waited. For years, the conflict between Saladin and the Crusader states continued through raids, sieges, negotiations, and temporary truces. Neither side could achieve a decisive victory. But Saladin's position was becoming stronger. By the early 1180s, much of Egypt and Syria was under his authority. He had created something the Crusaders had not faced before. A unified Muslim power stretching across enormous distances. And now Saladin could finally concentrate his strength against the Crusader kingdoms. But there was still one problem. The Crusaders themselves were divided. Some wanted peace. Others wanted war. And among the most aggressive was a powerful lord named Reinald of Chitillon. His actions would eventually help ignite the conflict Saladin had been waiting for. In 1186, a fragile truce stood between the two sides. But it would not last. A single act of defiance would change everything. And soon, two armies would begin moving toward the same battlefield. A battlefield that would decide the fate of Jerusalem. Part 3, the Crusader Kingdoms. By 1186, the balance of power in the Middle East had changed. Saladin had united Egypt and much of Syria. The Crusader states, meanwhile, were becoming increasingly divided. Jerusalem remained at the center of the conflict. For nearly a century, the city had been under Crusader control. Its walls represented the power of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. But that power was beginning to weaken. The kingdom depended on a fragile network of castles, fortified cities, and military orders. And its survival depended on keeping its enemies divided. Saladin understood this better than anyone. He knew that he could not simply storm Jerusalem. First, he needed to destroy the army that protected it. Then, an opportunity appeared. A powerful Crusader lord named Reinald of Chitillon repeatedly attacked Muslim trade routes and caravans, despite the existing truce with Saladin. Saladin demanded that the attacks stop. But Reinald refused. The situation became increasingly dangerous. Then, in 1186, Reinald attacked a major caravan traveling through the region. For Saladin, the truce was finished. He now had the justification he needed. War was coming. Across the Crusader kingdom, King Guy of Lusignan began gathering his forces. Knights from across the kingdom were called to arms. Templars and Hospitallers prepared for battle. Thousands of soldiers gathered around the royal army. The Crusaders believed they had the strength to defeat Saladin. But Saladin had prepared carefully. He gathered an enormous army from Egypt and Syria. His forces included cavalry, infantry, archers, and experienced commanders. And instead of attacking Jerusalem immediately, he created a trap. He wanted the Crusader army to leave its fortified positions. He wanted them away from their castles. Away from reliable water supplies. And out in the open. Saladin knew the land. He knew the heat. He knew the roads. And he knew that an army of heavily armed knights could become vulnerable if forced to march across the dry landscape. In the summer of 1187, the Crusader army finally began its march. Its destination was the Sea of Galilee. But between the Crusaders and their objective stood Saladin's army. The two forces moved closer. The temperature rose. Water became scarce. The Crusaders were exhausted before the main battle had even begun. Then Saladin made his move. His army surrounded the Crusader forces near the horns of Hattin. The battlefield was dry. The sun was merciless. And the Crusaders were trapped. They had left their secure positions. They had abandoned the protection of their castles. Now thousands of warriors stood in the open, surrounded by an enemy that had been preparing for this moment for years. Saladin had finally achieved what he wanted. The Crusader army was exactly where he needed it to be. The next morning, the battle would begin. And the Kingdom of Jerusalem would never be the same again. Part 4, The Battle of Hattin. The morning of July 4, 1187, began beneath a brutal sun. Near the horns of Hattin, the Crusader army was exhausted. Thousands of men had spent the previous day marching through dry, hostile terrain. They were desperate for water. Saladin had anticipated this. His forces surrounded the Crusaders from the surrounding hills. Mounted archers harassed their movements. Cavalry attacked their flanks. And every attempt to break through the encirclement was met by another wave of Muslim troops. The Crusaders were trapped. Their original objective had been the Sea of Galilee. But now they could barely move. Their horses were exhausted. Their soldiers were thirsty. And the heat was becoming unbearable. Then the fighting intensified. Saladin's archers filled the air with arrows. Crusader knights attempted to charge through the Muslim lines. For a moment, their heavy cavalry appeared capable of breaking the encirclement. But Saladin's forces repeatedly withdrew and attacked again. The Crusaders could not maintain momentum. Their formation began to collapse. The battle became chaotic. Smoke and dust covered the battlefield. Thousands of soldiers fought across the dry hills. At the center of the Crusader army stood the true cross, carried as a sacred symbol and source of inspiration. But even this could not restore order. The Crusader army was being destroyed. King Guy of Lusignan and many of his commanders were eventually captured. The famous Templar and Hospitaller knights who survived were surrounded. Reynald of Chatillon was also captured. For Saladin, the victory was enormous. The main field army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ceased to exist. But Hattin was more than a battlefield victory. It had opened the road to Jerusalem. Without a large army to defend the kingdom, many Crusader cities and fortresses suddenly stood isolated. One after another, they began to fall. Acre, Nazareth, Jaffa, Ascalon. The momentum was now entirely on Saladin's side. But the most important city remained: Jerusalem. For nearly 90 years, its walls had stood as the symbol of Crusader power in the Holy Land. Now Saladin's army was moving toward it. Inside the city, defenders prepared for a siege. The population knew what was coming. And outside the walls, Saladin prepared his army. He had spent decades building the power necessary for this moment. Now he was standing before the city that had defined the entire conflict. Jerusalem was surrounded. The siege began. And for the first time in almost a century, the fate of the Holy City was about to change. Part 5, Jerusalem and the Legacy. In September 1187, Saladin's army arrived before Jerusalem. The city was heavily fortified. Its massive walls had protected the Crusaders for generations. Inside, the defenders knew they faced an army far larger than their own. But they refused to surrender immediately. The siege began. Saladin's forces attacked the walls from several directions. Archers fired toward the defenders. Siege engines battered the fortifications. And day after day, the pressure increased. But Jerusalem was not an easy city to take. Its defenders fought desperately. Among them was Balian of Ibelin, a powerful Crusader nobleman who had taken command of the city's defense. For several days, the fighting continued. Then Saladin's forces broke through the walls. The defenders realized that further resistance could lead to a catastrophic massacre. Negotiations began. Balian met with Saladin. The fate of Jerusalem was decided through surrender rather than total destruction. On October 2, 1187, Saladin entered Jerusalem. The Crusader occupation of the city had ended. After almost 90 years, Jerusalem was once again under Muslim control. But what happened next would become an important part of Saladin's legacy. Unlike the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099, when Crusader forces had massacred many of the city's inhabitants, Saladin did not allow the city to be destroyed. Many Christians were permitted to leave after paying ransom. Others were released through negotiations. The holy places were preserved. The city survived. Saladin had won one of the greatest victories of the Crusades. But the war was not over. News of Jerusalem's fall shocked Europe. A new crusade was called. Among those who answered was one of the most famous rulers of medieval Europe, Richard the Lionheart. The Third Crusade would bring Saladin face to face with one of the greatest warriors of the Western world. Their battles would become legendary. Yet neither side would completely destroy the other. Eventually, Saladin and Richard reached an agreement. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control. Christian pilgrims would be allowed access to the holy city. The war ended without a simple victor. But Saladin's place in history was already secure. He had united a divided region. He had destroyed the main Crusader army at Hattin. And he had recaptured Jerusalem. Saladin died in Damascus in 1193. He left behind an empire, a legend, and a reputation that survived the medieval world. To his enemies, he had been a formidable opponent. To his followers, he was a defender of Islam. And to history, he became something even more unusual. A conqueror remembered not only for the battles he won, but for the way he chose to rule after victory. Saladin's story was never simply about defeating the Crusaders. It was about patience, strategy, unity, and power. And centuries after his death, his name still echoes through the walls of Jerusalem.